Good afternoon. The Select Committee on Veterans Housing will come back to order. We are back in session. You have a copy of the agenda for this afternoon. One item that we're going to delete for today is the financial review by Ms. Helen Roberts. We're going to do that tomorrow when we talk about veterans' homes, Minnesota veterans' homes. So first of all, I'd like to start this session off. We're discussing options and types of homes, types of housing for veterans, and to ask Mary Mullen from House Research to give an overview of the Veterans Administration programs that they have available and that they have in place for veterans. Many of those projects we don't have yet in Minnesota.
Good afternoon, Chairman and representatives. My name is Mary Mullen. I work at House Research, and I've been staffing the Select Committee on Veterans Housing. One of the things that this committee did over the summer was to take a tour of the VA Medical Center here in Minneapolis, and I'm going to go over some of the housing and healthcare programs that they have that provide services to veterans in this area and throughout the state. The VA Medical Center in Minneapolis and in St. Cloud have some of, but as the chairman alluded to, not all of the programs that are available through the federal VA. It's important to note that the VA Medical Center programs are funded by the Federal Veterans Administration, and that they are distinct and different from the state veterans home that is run by the Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs. On the memo that was handed out on page 7, there's a list of federally funded programs, and these vary as to whether or not they actually provide housing or as to whether or not they provide assistance for homeless veterans, or in some cases supportive services or employment services. One of the ones on here is listed as domiciliary care, which is what we typically think of as assisted living, and that is something that is provided through VA medical centers, and that typically provides housing for chemically dependent mentally ill and sometimes physically disabled veterans. Most of the other programs on this page are not going to be housing specific programs, and they're not going to necessarily be provided through the VA Medical Center. If you turn to page 11, that provides more information about long-term care options that are provided through the VA. The highlight here is going to be the nursing home or skilled nursing care that's provided by the VA, and that happens primarily in two ways. The first of those is the community living center, which is in the VA medical center itself, and the second piece of that is the contract private nursing home care. The VA contracts with private nursing homes in the community and provides medical services, skilled nursing care for veterans. In order to qualify for that program, the veteran does have to be 70% disabled, and this program helps to keep veterans near their community and allows the VA to provide more nursing home care for veterans than they would be able to in their community living center, which in the Minneapolis home, for example, only has 74 beds, and those beds are considered transitional. It's not long-term skilled nursing care, perhaps what you would think of in a private nursing home. So those are the two skilled nursing care services that the VA provides. The VA also provides a number of newer programs. One of them that's highlighted in here is the Medical Foster Care Program, and that is a program that is running out of the Minneapolis VA Medical Center. Right now they have 10 homes and those homes usually have 3 to 4 patients in each of them. And that's a program that does tend to keep people out of a nursing home because they are able to provide a skilled level of care. Other examples that they're doing that are similar to those are the adult day health care. Adult day health care allows someone to come in, 5 days a week during the day. They receive health care, rehabilitative services, recreational services, but they can still live in their own home or with family members. So adult day health care is another one of those alternative programs to provide health care and still keep people in their homes. They also have home-based primary care, which is something that is operating out of the Minneapolis VA Medical Center, which allows doctors and nurses to go from the VA Medical Center out to a patient's home, which may prevent them from having to go into a nursing home or another form of assisted living. The VA Medical Center also has hospice and beds for hospice and palliative care. They also have rehabilitative care for patients who need that as a transition for certain different kinds of medical problems they've been having. Those cover the major long-term care options that the VA is able to offer, specifically out of Minneapolis. And obviously, one other alternative that the VA offers is the State Veterans Home, which they do provide a per diem for, which covers 50% of the cost of care. So that's also considered an option that the VA does assist in funding.
Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned doctors and nurses go to their home. Is there a geographic area beyond which they wouldn't go? Or?
There is. I believe the VA Medical Center that's doing that is, I want to say it was a 40-mile or 40-minute radius from their campus.
Mary, are you going to talk about other VA programs that aren't offered in Minnesota? I know there's a sort of a group home type of facility that's offered, and some of the other things on sheets that we had from the federal VA.
I don't know that I have information about
Okay.
those.
Perhaps tomorrow, then I can bring that up. Is that it, Allison?
And I don't know if this question may fit somewhere better, but I think it was Representative Clark who said this morning that she referenced this one program in Minneapolis, and that did sound that it's one of those areas where they are being a bit flexible in their programming. So though it was housing for homeless people, they also had, did she call it assisted living? That was a wing of the that sounds a little like a flexible model that they're.
Yes, and it was, I think, more of getting them into the VA and getting them in the system and having the VA sort of provide caretaker services for them to make sure that they were being taken care of. As I understand it, they didn't necessarily have to be sober, but they had to be in a program, a VA program, to stay there.
And that would be 2 tiered levels of care, right? I mean, that
Yes.
a shelter, or I don't know if it was a shelter.
Yeah, and that was for homeless people, basically homeless. I don't think that was permanent housing, as I recall. Okay, is that it, Mary? Okay, thank you very much. And I also want to thank Mary for doing all of this work. She has just put so much into this, and where answers weren't readily available in one place, she went to another place and got answers. And we oftentimes found that we had, as Kathleen had mentioned this morning, in different agencies with different standards and different terminology, and it was very hard to, as we'll find out tomorrow from Commissioner Gallucci, it's hard to count beds sometimes, depending on who's doing the counting. So thank you, Mary.
Yeah, thank you.
Next, I would like to ask Melanie Butler, who's the director of Eagles Healing Nest, to come forward and testify. Ms. Butler, I believe you're from Brainerd, if I'm not mistaken, or that area? Sauk Center. Good. And this is her first time testifying, so be easy on her.
Please.
If you would identify yourself for the record, Ms. Butler.
I'm Melanie Butler, and I'm from Eagles Healing Nest, located in Sauk Center, Minnesota.
And if you'd like to go ahead and tell us what you want to say.
For a year, we have been providing a safe home for our veterans, military members, as well as networking providers and assisting the VA system in helping heal our veterans. We have our nonprofit, we're a 501c3, and it's based on mother's love. And so we don't necessarily fall under the red tape and issues that others have. We are licensed as a board and lodge and a board and lodge of special services, but it was based on their military service. So for a year, we have been at maximum capacity, supporting the veterans in need. We are a substance-free, alcohol-free environment. We work very closely with the detox center. We get referrals from the VA system. 90% of our veterans come from the St. Cloud VA, either entering into a program and can't get in, or leaving the program with no place to go. We also receive referrals from state agencies such as Department of Health and Human Services based on the county, VSOs from across the state, as well as veteran referrals. And they come to us with a whole host of issues, but we, for some, we're their only place to call home. And it's based on the fact that they help each other. They serve together and they can heal each other. It's a different approach. It's out of the box than the norm. So we provide the loving home that they need and the support, but we also reintegrate them with the assistance of Battle Buddy to Battle Buddy and outreach a host of providers that provide services to them on-site and off-site. They give back to each other. We have helped over 100 veterans just this year. Some are still, we can currently house, we were at 35 yesterday in 6 hours. The veterans converted 6 offices to 6 more beds and bedrooms. It's their home. It's giving back. They don't want to leave anyone behind. The problem that we're finding is that we receive no outside funding. We've applied for the grants on the federal level. I have had conference calls with them. We have not received any on the state. We are and have operated on a shoestring budget, or we call it a wing and a prayer. We don't receive state, federal, county. Legislature had a memorandum placed that there could be no more board and lodge in Stearns County. Stearns County is holding that, our feet to the fire and not doing that. So when counties call with a veteran in need and in crisis and they have no place to place them, they have the means to do that through GRH funding or through board and lodge or special services, because we can't get that host county contract. And although that veteran doesn't have the means to do that, they are eligible for those funds. We can't take them, but we still take the veteran because we don't want to leave them behind. We
Ms.
receive
Butler, if I can interrupt just for a moment. You say your license, is that through the county?
through the state of Minnesota
Through the
and
state?
the county.
Okay, thank you.
Correct. We have reached out, and again, working with the care providers within the VA system, have asked for those. They issue contracted beds, meaning that if a veteran is at the VA Medical Center, they can contract a bed. They contract beds to other organizations that provide temporary housing or transitional housing. We've asked to be able to do that, and they have told us that they're not offering those contracts at this time, although 90% of our veterans come from there. We have a multitude that come with and are eligible for a HUD-VASH voucher. When they receive those vouchers in the Stearns County area, there's only a couple places that take those vouchers. They've asked to be able to use them to contribute to their stay while they're at the nest temporarily, and that has been declined because it doesn't fit into their criteria. I think that's something that we need to review and asking for all of you to review. We talk about cost effectiveness and budgets. We based the nest based on that. We didn't want to leave anyone behind, based on our own experiences as as moms and families. watching one generation give back to the other. So in 2 months, with nothing but hard work and donations from within our family, we renovated the 2 buildings out of the 24 on the old state facility to be able to house 35. Now we can house 40. So those are dollar donations, $10 donations. Other veteran organizations such as the Military Order of the Purple Heart, National Homeless Director has endorsed us as the model that we need to look to, vets giving back to vets, creating their own place to heal, but utilizing the resources that are out there. I've been advocating for a very long time for veterans. The system is overloaded and only going to be more overloaded. In the year that we've been open, I have been blessed to see veterans go home to their families. I have seen veterans heal, be entered into the system that was supposed to provide the resources they needed in it entirely, but had no place to go to be safe. They are now working for the Department of Corrections, mentoring other veterans. We have a host of veterans that are in the training for peer-to-peer, which is now being recognized as a great way for them to give back and get back on their feet. It's a journey. It's not a destination. The nest has just became part of that resource and path on that journey for them to reintegrate back. And we're looking for guidance, assistance, support to do that. They give back. Out of the 35 veterans, as of late afternoon, we will have 40 veterans, so we are at maximum capacity. I have a waiting list. That was something we never wanted to have at the nest, never have to turn anyone behind. Those veterans that are calling from the programs that they're in at the VA, because they use us as a resource, they refer veterans to us, have asked to pitch a tent. If I allow that to happen, then we create what we did after Vietnam, little camp cities for them to take care of each other. So I'm doing the best I can, rallying our volunteers and those that are helping us renovate each of the buildings. When they get through the backlog of their benefits as well as find employment, they do contribute to their stay, but in order for them to reintegrate, they have to be able to save. So we do it on a sliding fee as well. And it's working. It's what they say they need. It's a resource that we've been providing. And part of that is an acknowledgement that we have a system that's overloaded. And that as family members, as moms, as a mom that had her son turned away, as moms that I visit with on a weekly basis that are their families are in crisis, or that have lost their children to suicide because of the hopelessness that they felt and getting caught in the red tape. They have hope. They come there. It's not a facility, it's a home. But it's a home that helps reintegrate them into the systems that are there to help them.
Good. Are there any questions? Representative Hausman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I heard the testifier say twice the system is overloaded, and I think in some ways that was one of the pieces of our early information that we kept hearing. For me, it was our Ramsey County Veteran Service Officer who was in my office, I think, on their day on the Hill, and she said most of her time was spent helping family members try to find temporary housing while they were on the waiting list. And it sounds like perhaps that was early motivation for you, some of the, personal experience where you were motivated to help individuals who hadn't gotten into the system, or?
Could I answer?
Yes,
Sure.
go ahead, Ms. Butler.
My journey started actually when I was 7, around a bonfire with Vietnam veterans who shared their stories. And I promised them that I would never let anyone forget and that I always reach out. There isn't any more. One of those men was my stepfather. He took his own life. When it was my own son, I was challenged to come to be part of the solution and not part of the problem, because I do have a big mouth and I don't necessarily always say it politically correct. But it was watching them give back at stand-downs to each other, that they would give up their gear for an Iraqi or an Afghani vet and tell them that take this, but go back inside and see the providers. It was just giving them hope. They just need someone to listen to them. I had another veteran tell me that although I started my journey going back to school to be a counselor, he said, don't do that, because then your hands are tied. You can't do what you do best. And I didn't understand until we were open about 6 weeks, and another mom brought her son to the nest. She didn't know what else to do. She had small children. And the media is not always very military friendly because we only see the ugly, we don't see the good. And he scaled the walls of the nest, and it was his band of brothers. But that night he couldn't sleep. And so I sat in his room, as I did with my own kids, and I held his hand. And he may only been able to sleep for an hour and wake back up. If I put those titles and those licenses behind my name, I can't be a mom and I can't give them the love and support. So I had to call him back and say, okay, you were right, but I'm going to need help. And so that's why we have solutions providing mental health. We have Sobriety First offering addiction. We get them back into the VA. A battle buddy goes with them. But it's that being overloaded, and it's getting worse. We have 22 suicides a day. And most of that is because they feel hopeless. They just want the pain to end. They don't believe anyone understands, but they do understand each other. And family members understand each other.
And then just a clarifying question, when we had the presentation this morning from, I think that was MHFA, it sounded as though the HUD-VASH vouchers were something they were given to use wherever in the private market they would be able to find housing. But in this case, it sounds like that still has some limitations about where they're able to use the vouchers.
Yes. There is a limitation, and I'm still learning that system. I'm still learning as I go. It's my understanding from working with those that provide those vouchers through the St. Cloud VA when they have them. So they come to us as a transitional looking for housing. The housing provider has to accept those vouchers, and not all of them do. And it's my understanding in the St. Cloud area there's only a couple. And the experience that the veterans have had using those vouchers at those facilities is not a safe environment for them in the experiences that we've had. I can't speak for all of them, but I'm still trying to understand that system in its entirety.
Ms. Butler, thank you. It's very compelling testimony. And I would ask that you speak with Nancy Conley here. And Nancy, the reason is that I think maybe Ms. Butler should try to get before the State Government Committee and Veterans Affairs Committee and make a pitch for funding, as so many other organizations do. But I think this is something worthy of consideration at least, and you can sort of guide her as to what she would have to do. Are there any other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Yes. Kathleen, you back up again, and perhaps you can speak to that HUD-VASH voucher and the difficulties that people might have in securing housing once they have the voucher. To me, it sounds a lot like Section 8, and that not everyone accepts it.
But in their case, they would accept it. That's what I didn't quite understand.
Yes.
Both the veteran would want to use it, and it sounds like they would accept it.
If you can find a provider that will accept it, is that correct?
Yeah, well, if I might answer the question, and again, I know from my experience, I'm not the federal VA nor the person covering HUD-VASH. That program it's a permanent supportive housing model program. If you're I do transitional housing. I cannot use, Ms. Butler's program is considered, I believe, transitional. You cannot use vouchers for those programs. It has to be for permanent supportive housing. And also, I think as you were talking about, it is, a way to look at it is a veteran Section 8 with VA case management. So that's where the Public Housing Authority has its piece of that voucher as far as working with the landlords and eligibility and things like that. But then the supportive service piece are federal federal VA, I'm going to try to do this now, federal VA case managers that get assigned and provide the supportive service piece. But those individuals have a lease, they have a permanent place to live, and you work with individual landlords then, the Public Housing Authority, as they do with Section 8, on who will take this voucher. There's reporting requirements and things like that from a Public Housing Authority's perspective. So you work with landlords to see who's willing to take a voucher, and then the veteran gets to choose where to live. Now, that's the program called Housing Choice Vouchers, where the veteran chooses where to take their voucher. There's also project-based HUD-VASH vouchers that some of you might have heard about, which is a separate notice of funding availability that has to come out from HUD, that people with projects can bid on getting some project-based vouchers. The voucher stays with the project, not the veteran. So then you can have a project that has some. I might have confused you more, but it's a complicated thing. Permanent housing, it's about models and definitions and funding sources. And that voucher is tied to permanent housing, not transitional.
Well, and I think Ms. Butler brought up a good point that the places that might accept these vouchers are not necessarily safe places for veterans, and we're already dealing with a vulnerable community. So there should be some way to ensure that, that the housing is safe before the veterans move in.
If I could just,
Yes.
and again, I'm not the Public Housing Authority or the federal VA sitting here, but I know some of our veterans have gotten HUD-VASH vouchers, so I talk from that perspective, is that the Public Housing Authority works with these landlords as well, and there are eligibility criteria. I don't know the depth of which they check the landlords out, but then the case manager assigned by the VA certainly is also looking at if you chose to live where, or, I think together they are trying to ensure that that is a good, solid, appropriate placement in a supportive environment for that veteran. And that's what the case management also gets you, that if it's not working out, or if it's in a bad area, or if it's just not a good place, they will suggest possibly a different area to look. Because, again, the voucher in that program goes with the veteran. So they could go to another landlord or another place, if that kind of helps just a little bit.
Thank you.
But
We'll
And
let you get back to your...
I will attempt, I will also say when it's not my program, I only know what I know, as they say. I think, and I wanted to start, because this is the housing section that I was asked to speak to and explain MACV housing. But with that, I think as an education tool, I wanted to talk about some terms and definitions as we all talk about, and we've heard before. And that's where you've got that continuum of care, and you start with emergency housing, transitional housing, permanent supportive, and permanent. They all, that's the model. I think the first thing you need to do is, in a community, what model of housing do you need for the people, that the veterans that are presenting themselves? Once you decide on a model, is it a shelter? Is it transitional housing? Is it permanent or permanent supportive? Then you start looking at the funding streams that are available. I have a transitional model of housing, structured independent living, scattered site, that I will talk about. It has different funding streams associated with each of those homes, but the model and the program are consistent. And I think that's where some of the confusion comes in, is that you have to look at what sort of services, what sort of housing, and what model do you need, and then start to look at what funding is making itself available to do that, if that makes sense. And another term, affordable housing. Well, what is affordable housing? There's a lot of different definitions. I just wanted to put forward, in general, you are not spending more than 30% of your income on where you live. That's what people are talking about, affordable units. What does that mean? None of us should spend more than 30% of our income on our housing. If you do, you have moved into that area of that's not sustainable for you, we need to look for something different. So I'm just hoping that I can kind of be a little bit of education along the way. And I did pass out, because, and I apologize, I found it last night because I was looking for it. I passed out to you Developing Permanent Supportive Housing for Homeless Veterans, done by the Corporation for Supportive Housing and the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, a document done in 2008. I'm going to point to a couple pages in that document. It is still a great guide on definitions, services. What are we talking about when we're talking about permanent supportive housing? Nationally, where do these terms come from? And I think if you use that as another guide for definitions, it's really good. And I wanted to take a moment. Mary's research, I have to say, this is a formidable area to go into, and almost 99% of the time, people that try to do research and get information fall way short on getting their answers. Not their fault, but it's complicated. Excellent, excellent job. I went through your report, and it's spot on. So it's a very complicated thing. That's really a good document to also use. So what I wanted to point to about supportive housing is that, and I don't read, I'm only going to read a little bit this time because the definitions are important. Successful, cost-effective combination of affordable housing with services that help people live more stable, productive lives. The effectiveness of supportive housing and ending homelessness depends on the willingness to take risks and experiment with new models, approaches, and strategies. So the definition of it, you could have a variety of models when you implement. And I think that got to Representative Clark this morning. I wrote it down, assisted living in public housing. That's interesting. I don't know how they did it. I don't know how they paid for it, but some of those units actually assisted living within public housing. Interesting model. Now go, how do you fund something like that? And is it sustainable? Is it available in every community? And do we need it? The other thing are 5 elements that you need for a successful supportive housing project. Of course, the people, the place, the services, the money, and the organization. Now that might seem like some simple things. All 5 need to be there. And when you start looking at the 3 components to a project, and I'm setting this up for why and how I did my housing and why I think it was successful, is that I had the capital piece lined up, the development budget. I had sources for that. I had ongoing operating dollars lined up. And I had the supportive service piece lined up. Those 3 components must be there, all of them, for a long-term solution. And you will falter if any one piece is missing. And I think then it becomes very, very difficult to, if you've got your capital dollars, but you don't have those other 2 pieces, you don't have a project yet. And I think that's what you have to be aware of when you're looking at models to implement in communities. Are all 3 of those pieces there and viable in a long-term solution? The other, again, I just thought, along with Mary's research, this guide also talks about the operating budget, what those costs are. I think that's pretty straightforward. But the other thing it does, on page 77, is it talks about the supportive service piece. This, now I'm tagging into my slide, getting to my housing. What are supportive services in permanent supportive housing? And again, it isn't a medical model. These are the sort of things that case managers coordinate. They coordinate services and care. They don't provide certain things directly, but life skills training, educational services. Minnesota Housing said it this morning. Permanent supportive housing is still independent living. There's that line, and it is always a line, where sometimes, and people in our housing, MACV housing, are in permanent supportive, we eventually make a recommendation for them that they no longer can actually be independently living anymore. Their supportive services have increased to the point where they need to move to the next place on the continuum, which may be the veterans home. It may be assisted living. It may be a variety of things. But it's constantly looking at, are they independent? Now, does that mean they can live without any of these supportive services? Well, that's what independent means. They won't, as we have found, live as successfully as if they had these services. And that's why the model is there. And it's, when I talk about my permanent supportive housing, the services, again, are more related to case management. They can't remember to pay their rent on time. They're not remembering, they don't balance their checkbook. They have money, but they bounce checks. They don't remember to pay their utility bills. I just had a veteran in my supportive housing that was presented with an electric shutoff. Now they have to pay their own utility bills. That was an interesting case management issue for us, for him. He thought he had. But these individuals can live independently otherwise. So think of it as life living skills and supportive services that we provide. And I'll answer, as I go along, I'll answer any questions. The first piece I'm going to talk about as I move through this continuum of housing will be our transitional housing. And the very first program, because it'll be one of the most complicated ones, but it is talked about in all of this pre-literature that I looked at, is our Building 47 program. Building 47 is a 13-bed residential facility for homeless veterans on the Minneapolis VA campus. It is funded by a VA grant and per diem. This is one of the things on page 7 in Mary's Veterans Housing Programs, a grant and per diem. Only one minor error I found in your entire presentation. It actually is $41.90 a day. Oh, they've really upped that per diem, let me tell you. But it is a program that you have to apply for if a notice of funding availability is issued. When they issue them, they only issue them annually. We have had this contract for years. It is renewed. As long as the budgets are there, when people get per diem beds, they generally are renewed. The question about, is this a feasible program for a new project? No. They are not. Right now, I don't even know about a new NOVA that they're doing. I don't know about, they're staying with the contracts they have, and very little new is being done. And I think that's when you look at all these funding streams, other things that you have to take into account. But it does have up to 65% of capital funding. The per diem now is an ongoing thing that we get. And Building 47 on the VA Medical Center campus for us is a lease. We didn't have to build it. We didn't have to, and the lease is extremely reasonable, nothing. And if I didn't have that kind of lease for that housing, $41.90 a day is not going to pay for the veterans that live there. So that program has a lot of things that you have to look at as well. If you think $41.90 a day is going to pay for the meals and support and case management of the veterans that are living somewhere and pay for the housing that they're in, it's not going to. But it was a good fit for the arrangement that I was able to get with the Minneapolis VA to be able to lease that building. They also have, and Mary talked about this, their mental health homeless program. I don't want to get into a lot of, she did a really nice job about different VA services, so I don't have to do that. I want to move next into my structured independent living homes. Now, I'm not talking about what funds them yet. Transitional housing. The industry has defined transitional housing for the most part, and I mean federal and state, up to 2 years. It's a place to land, it's a place to stabilize, then you're ready to move on to your own permanent solution, which may be permanent supportive. But the idea is that you can move out of that and you've gotten the skills needed to then move in and be able to have a lease and have your own housing. We started, let me go to the next. We provide supportive services, the same screen as before. For this transitional housing, we provide case management and living skills. Very similar services to permanent supportive, but probably a little bit more hands-on, especially at first. They need more interaction and intervention and help. Our newest structured independent living home, and we have 10 of them, is in St. Paul, and I wanted to mention it is transitional housing for women veterans. Now, what I want to do is for a moment, what are these homes and how did I acquire them? I acquired these homes throughout the last 12 years in a variety of fashions, but the model and the program is the same. It depends on what community I was in. My first 7 homes were a federal VA program that got discontinued. They had these foreclosed properties and they didn't know what to do with them, and they had VA mortgages, so we assumed the VA mortgages on these homes. 5 of my homes still have a mortgage. That is not the model I like, because that is money I am spending ongoing and having to fundraise for. Those homes I fundraise for. Ongoing maintenance, supportive services. I get people to adopt a home. I get foundations to adopt a home. It works really well. That's what I do with that initial. I don't have any other federal or state programs that are doing anything for them. So there's scattered site housing, South Minneapolis, Richfield, our women's home in St. Paul, and Maplewood, which I hope, because I wanted to pause on the Maplewood home. That opened 2 years ago. This was not a VA, this was a new program. And it came about because Ramsey County came to me and said, the commissioners, how do I get one of those homes you do for homeless veterans, transitional housing, on this side of the river? Minneapolis has all of those, South Minneapolis, how do we get one over here? So I told them my terms were, you have to find a home, you have to rehab it, and you have to turn the deed over to me, free and clear. No, but I do the hard part, right? I run it ongoing, and I get the operating dollars, and I case manage the people that live there. I thought it was a pretty fair deal. By golly, they stepped up. And again, it was certain funding streams that were available to them in the county at that time that they were able to make this happen. I don't know if those funding streams are available at this moment, but you have to look at what's available when you want to do something. It is the same program with the same rules that I run in Minneapolis and all of our other homes. So I think as a person looking to do housing, the first thing you do is go to your community partners. I started with the county. They wanted to know what it would take. I'm not going to have another mortgage, because how am I going to deal with all those costs ongoing? And together, we figured it out. And I think that's another piece. But again, I point out, it's not the same funding stream as any of the other 9 homes that I have, just the same program. This is our home in St. Cloud. We have a transitional home near the St. Cloud VA. Same program. It was one of the VA foreclosed homes. So I fundraise locally to get people to support ongoing maintenance. I also should say that when you're doing things like this, a lot of people think that if you like this model, some of you may be thinking, well, there's a lot of foreclosed homes out there. We'll just do that. We'll do all this scattered site housing with these foreclosed homes. Well, with that comes a lot of rehab work. And when the VA, I assumed those mortgages about 12 years ago in those initial homes, they were federal property, which meant that Minneapolis could not touch them. They could not, they were exempt from any inspections. The week the mortgages got turned over to the nonprofit, I had inspections in all those homes, and I am telling you, I had 27 pages of things that were wrong that I had to fix. So with that comes community planning and economic development in Minneapolis. At that time, there was a fund that I was able to get $200,000 to use to rehab these properties and fix all the stuff that we had to fix. So it's not necessarily, it's a good idea to look at foreclosed homes if a community would like to do something like this. The properties are there, but the properties have a cost, as all things do. And that gets back to the original plan. What is your plan for rehabbing, operating, and supportive services? That's going to make a successful model.
Kathleen,
Yes.
can I ask, as you're going along, are these single-family homes now? Are they group homes?
These transitional homes, the one for women is for either, it's a two-bedroom, 2 women veterans or a woman and her children. Currently, we have 2 women veterans in them. The other homes, the model that we implemented is single male adult. The other homes that we operate are single male adult. That's that program because it's communal living, and we set up their roommates. So they pay a program fee, not rent, but they pay a program fee. They have to save so much of their money every month. We look, and they have to, if they have work, they bring in proof of work, but they live together, which teaches them some living skills before they can move out on their own. It's learning how to, and it's things like, I can't tell you how irritated they get over, I'm the one always buying the dish liquid. I'm the one always doing the dishes. It causes almost violence in these, so it's these living skills are totally important. Is it a medical model? No, it is not. But these supportive services are about teaching them how to interact again, how to socialize, how to get back into the community. So single male adults and our one for women veterans. I am, now myself as MACV, I am looking at this scattered site model. It works for us. I like it. So I'm always open to other opportunities in other communities to look at this model. If Brainerd came to me and said, we would like one of these homes in Brainerd, I would say, well, what is the city going to put in? What's the county going to put in? What are they going to do? So that is something I'm willing to look at under what programming MACV does. It relates directly to our mission. I'm also looking right now, so you know, North Minneapolis. I need a transitional home in North Minneapolis. And so people have, I can't say who yet, but a sports team that isn't building a stadium right now said they were very interested in supporting that initial capital along with some other partners like Rebuilding Together. You have to look in your community who's already out there to do different things. And if I get that initial capital in rehab, I have the fundraising and the programming to sustain it with our services and case management and things like that.
Representative Detmer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And with your 3 regional sites in your MACV headquarters,
Yes.
I know you use the word I a lot, but I know you got a staff.
Oh, yes.
What
I equals
how many-
MACV.
How many people are working under MACV?
28.
28.
I have 28 staff. A lot of them are, direct outreach staff. And I'm going to show you now each of the regions in the housing that we have there. But for a structured independent living home, a case manager in the metro area, for example, I have one full-time case manager that case manages those beds in the 6 homes that we have there. So then when we move to the other models, I'll talk to the staff that actually, how much staff do you need to do this and where are they paid for? But yes, I have 28 full-time staff that do all of the MACV services. So starting up in Duluth, focusing on housing, again, this structured independent living model. 3 years ago, a nonprofit named Lifehouse, who does youth programs, had this home, and they had programs and programming for it, but they couldn't sustain it. They couldn't operate it. It had, hopefully, there are the funding sources. It had home dollars, you're probably familiar with that, City of Duluth HIF money, Duluth HRA money, Minnesota Housing. Originally, when this youth program set this up, they had some Minnesota Housing money, Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, and HUD. I was approached, MACV was approached, actually it really was me that day, but to take over this house. And I said again, how am I going to operate it and case manage and do the supportive services ongoing? And would it fit our structured independent living model? And does the community need it? And it was, yes, they need it. Yes, all of these funding sources agreed to turn over to MACV. And we now have a structured independent living home. This one is for single adult men in Duluth. And we're looking for this sort of thing in that area for women veterans as well. But it's a complicated funding stream, all with eligibility, reporting requirements, but for the most part, homeless veterans. Transitional housing are living there. And this has, that came with it, an operating and supportive service grant that is a renewing grant with HUD. Now, when you get something like this, and it's available through the HUD Continuum of Care process, which would be happy to answer some questions on, but it's a whole nother education unto itself and how they do things. But the funding became available to do this, and that was my long-term solution. There is a match. I have to come up with 20%, which I do with my other grants. But I had the total solution to take this home over, and I did it. And it's a very successful piece of housing in Duluth for us, for veterans. I'm now going to talk about, so I had our VA grant and per diem that you've heard about, Building 47, my transition, which is also considered transitional housing, my transitional housing, structured independent living, variety of models and funding streams, same program. Now I'm going to move into my permanent supportive housing. And I have 2 projects that are permanent supportive housing. So when Minnesota Housing talked about 4,000 units of affordable housing, I'm 22 of those. I went after some of that funding. And so 11 units that has Minnesota Housing funding is our Duluth Veterans Place. Now, Duluth Veterans Place were 3 pieces of property in Duluth, in West Duluth. And this was one of the largest leaps I took. And believe me, I made sure all those 3 pieces were there because we had to rehab these buildings. And what happened is that, well, they said rehab, and it was a little extensive. This is what it looks like today. On the left is MACV Duluth, which is our offices down below. Up above are 5 units of transitional housing. Now, I fund that, and I have different sources for that. That's a great model to have transitional housing right there. The other building is 11 units of permanent supportive housing. So what you have all in one piece of property, here's another interesting model. You have the service provider located there. You have transitional beds to stabilize individuals that may or may not want to stay in Duluth, but they're there now. And you have permanent supportive beds that you can move them into, or others in the Duluth community that are appropriate for that housing. So those funding sources are listed here. And again, Minnesota Housing, I have LTH dollars that were mentioned in that, Corporation for Supportive Housing, Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, FHLB is Federal Home Loan Bank, TIF proceeds, LISC, St. Louis County, and you'll see in this guide that I passed out, there are also a lot of different funding sources. Tax credits are talked about. I didn't use any tax credits, but that certainly is something that is available to people in certain communities and certain projects. But as you can see here, the entire community got involved in this housing, and I think that's why it was successful. I went to the community and asked what they wanted and what they needed, and could this be the thing that could provide that? And so that's what we did all along the way. There were some things not covered by any of those. I'm just pointing this out when you're doing capital things. There were items that none of those funding sources would pay for. And we did a campaign to raise that extra $100,000. So that's our Duluth housing. Now, when I did this morning, I said I own and operate 77 units of housing. That's the transitional and permanent supportive. I already talked about all the services we provide to keep people in their housing, or the rent deposits we can do to get people in their housing. But where appropriate, we provide some of our own. Mankato was our first project that opened up in fall of 2006. And it is a beautiful program. So I have the most data on this project because it's been running the longest for us. Again, 11 units of permanent supportive housing. Little bit different model, 3 townhomes. The other one were apartment building. What works? What is your community? This was a new build for us, and it worked very well. One of the key things with this is the land was donated to us. That was another key piece. I didn't have that cost to try to raise money for. Permanent supportive housing with services. Funding sources, some similar to Duluth, the big ones, Minnesota Housing. I have a HUD operating and supportive service grant, renewing, ongoing, and it does have a match, but that's that piece to keep it going that's very important. And Blue Earth County really stepped up too. I can't tell you enough that my opinion is that if you do any of this community-based housing, you go to the city and the county and the state and the federal government, and they all do their piece. And that's when they all really pull together and you can get the funding that you need to do. These are just pictures of when we were building it, but this is the housing today. And I think one of the keys is that these individuals that live there, we have had a couple that were finally referrals to the veterans home. But that was after they were able to live independently 5 more years with some supportive services. And prior to this particular housing development, for us, for veterans in that area, they might have had to have, they wouldn't have been able to stay as independent for as long. They would have had to have made another choice that they weren't necessarily quite ready to make. But, so I just look at it, it allows, back to my very first thing I said, options and choices for the person. And what does the person want to do, and all those options and choices out there. That was Secretary Shinseki. I show this because nationally, this model and what we did was nationally recognized, and he actually visited our townhomes and talked to the residents that lived there. These were the World War II veteran that donated the land. He and his wife, and sadly they both passed on. This is my, she'll kill me because this is the only picture of staff that I have in there. This is my regional director, Sue Worlds in Mankato, and she does a wonderful, wonderful job with this ongoing case management and supportive service piece. And there's our little kitty that we allowed to stay there. What is supportive services? That's what I'm trying to show. For him, it was having a little kitty. It was being able to do different things that support them ongoing. But again, not the medical model. So I wanted to, oh, these are the I'll leave this up and then take your questions. These are the radical, the Mankato Permanent Supportive Housing Townhome clients spelling out MACV for me. So they said if I could use that when I end my slide presentations, they really like that. So you can see the individuals that are here. They have issues, but they're not ready for they're not ready for what a veterans home program is or an assisted living is. They just need some help. They need to be checked up on. They need this community of each other. So it's that continuum of care that you have to decide, what is an individual appropriate for? What do they need? And then, does it exist in this community? And if it doesn't, do we want to build it? And for MACV, I will continue to look at the scattered site. I am not against looking at some of the bigger projects like these 11 units of complicated funding streams and permanent supportive housing. I will do that. But I am not a housing developer by core mission. I do it when no one else is in the community that's going to step up to do it, because I see a need that it's there to do. I would love it if this housing and all these units were done by others and they were there as referral points for I have 77 beds. Remember that other 1,300 veterans that we assist in their families every year. We would love great new projects to be able to refer veterans to. And that's what I hope to do with projects like Common Bond, what I do now with the Al Lair Apartments in St. Cloud with veterans and community housing. We refer our veterans to that housing as it's appropriate. So it's a wonderful combination. And as a segue, I did have my staff over lunch call Veterans and Community Housing. They check veteran eligibility by getting it from the federal VA. So they're doing it right. And I think it brings up, as I was speaking with Representative Detmer, it is very key, though, that if you're going to provide veteran housing, someone who is qualified must do veteran verification in order to keep that on the up and up. So I'll take any questions that you have, but that's kind of the housing that I do. I hope that the piece I handed out about permanent supportive housing is a nice guide for definitions for you. And I think there's a lot of different, first decide your model that you need, then you look at the funding sources that are available, and can you do it long term, if that makes sense.
Are there any questions? I have one, Kathleen, and that
Yes.
has to do with your relationship with MDVA.
Yes.
I know you do referrals when that becomes necessary, but the housing that you have is really through the federal VA programs and not MDVA, is that correct?
Partially.
Okay.
Sure. The Building 47 is a federal VA contract. The other structured independent living homes, I fundraise for. That doesn't use state or federal dollars. I fundraise to ongoing, costs for them. The permanent supportive housing does not use Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs money. In my permanent supportive housing projects, I listed those funds there, which is a mix of Minnesota housing money and federal sources like Federal Home Loan Bank and HUD as a federal source for the supportive service piece, but not the Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs. So by and large, the capital money for my permanent supportive housing in both of my projects the largest piece came from Minnesota Housing, and that set aside from their long-term homeless funding, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay, any other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Been very informative. Does anyone in the audience have any questions, comments, or would they like to have any testimony? Commissioner, is there anything that you would like to add, or either of the commissioners?
No, sir. I think that we're probably at tomorrow.
You're on for tomorrow. Okay.
When is our agenda tomorrow?
Tomorrow, we're going to discuss long-term care and with particular focus on the Minnesota housing for veterans.
And then, Mr. Chair, I don't know whether we'll ever get at this issue. You know, one of the things I think that started us down this path is we had the feeling that the federal government has run out of money. That traditional system that we've been depending on, that we hear they have very little money at the federal level for the entire country. And whether it was as a result of that or this federal cap on beds for Minnesota, that we were putting money into one facility, but we're feeling this demand all over the state. And we had occasion, Representative Detmer and I were on the capital investment tour, and we went to both Brainerd and Bemidji. And in both of those stops, local communities, local veterans communities told about both their need and their dream. And you hear this strong desire out there and the argument about decentralization, keeping them close to family and friends. And but in a sense, that's because you almost had the feeling we're sort of trapped as a state in this federal system that has no money and that says we've imposed a cap on the number of beds that doesn't that's out of sync with with the need that we're feeling.
And I think, Representative Hausman, that's one of the things that looking at what Ms. Vitalis is doing with MACV, that it might be one of the directions we want to go in. If we don't have an increase in the number of beds, and in the event that there are no federal funds, we may want to put some money into local projects and get the local communities involved and the counties and all the other local authorities. So I think that might be a new model for expanding out. And then we're no longer restricted by the federal restrictions as to so many hours away from another facility or distance. Commissioner?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, thank you. So let me try to, I've been chasing this since before they shut down in Washington. So let me get this right out front for you. The Phase 3, which I know you've asked me about, Representative, the federal grant right now, I thought we were right there for them to issue something to us. I don't suspect that now we'll see something formally from them, most likely by the end of the year with the shutdown. And the last status that I have that I'm glad to say to you is that they issued a total of 56 projects that made the first cut. Minnesota was in the first cut. What does that mean? I don't know. 56, and then they're in there slotting it, and then having their legal department review. To your point, yes, in fiscal year 12, I believe it was, they had $285 million. Don't quote me on the exact amount, but it was in 280 something for construction grants that was reduced in this prior year to $83 million. They're forecasting another $83 million for construction grants. So they look at this from their priority basis of renovations, new homes, and I believe that we've provided a copy. I apologize, I don't have all that with me, but in the questions and everything that this committee generated, they submitted that issue. To your point of bed count, more digging. As I went through 38 CFR one weekend when I had absolutely nothing to do, I chased it all the way back to 2001. In 2008, the state of Minnesota had 982 beds, I believe the number was. They review that cap every 4 years. The last review for the state of Minnesota was in 2010. In 2010, they bumped us to 1,058 beds. So technically, we're due for a review in 2014. I'm going to assume it's not their fiscal year 2014, but the calendar year. And should this subcommittee and the legislature give the commissioner the direction that he should seek additional beds, then we will prepare a packet to move forward for the secretary to approve. To your question, or issue, Chair. I don't know, did I answer your question, Representative?
Well, Mr. Chair, I guess I would just respond, because what we had heard is this year, you cited 2012, but we had heard this year that federally it was like 80 million, not 200 million, but 80 million for the entire nation.
You're correct. My apologies with the fiscal year thing.
Yeah.
Because wasn't even here in fiscal year 12. So you're correct. Fiscal year 13 and then going into 14, it was reduced from 280 to 83 million.
So, I mean, this is the staggering thing,
Yeah.
83 million for the entire nation.
But I will say-
Every state would have the same problems that we've been hearing about today in terms of lack of beds. And I think the thing that a state finds frustrating is that the federal government arbitrarily puts a cap on beds that doesn't reflect anything about our local needs in this state. And that's why I think so many people are saying, does this system make any sense? And would we be better off to freelance and do it ourselves?
So I would, if I may, Mr. Chairman, Representative, I think, and I apologize because I really won't, much of this will be discussed a little bit tomorrow, or in detail tomorrow, and so I am with what I have. But basically, first of all, I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think that it is a constraint that they must place on themselves because obviously there's a huge need and there's a budgetary consideration. And I think that what I'm seeing from my viewpoint is that there's a lot of shifting within the VA to try to deal with homelessness, to deal with backlogs of disability. So as their budget is going down, there's a much larger desire on their part to partner with the state veterans homes. To your point about where are we going from there, and isn't there another avenue for us to do? Here's what I would say to you. The VA, the federal VA, I would say to you this. The VA would not stop you from building as many veterans homes as you want. But they're not going to give you per diem for anything more than that. So at the end of the day, the state will incur the cost for that cost of care for that veteran wherever they are. And I think that that's what the end result is. I'm not saying that that's a perfect solution, that that's a solution, and I'm not saying that it's not flawed. What I'm saying is that in the instant, this is what we have. And to your point that you've made quite clear, we need to find a new way of doing that. And I think that this is a great committee to start that and engage that both on a state and then a federal level. But know, as I know you do, that it's not going to happen overnight. So we're trying to find that balance in MDVA right now of how we do what we do at the moment. And, you know, this, one of the things that you'll see tomorrow, I know that Mary put it in your packets, is that there is a whole new model out there. One of those models is private management, state-owned, because that's the requirement of the state veterans program, is that it must be state-owned, the building, the property, but private enterprising managing that with one state employee there representing the interest of the state. And as you look in the back of your packet that Mary put together, she has a number of those states that use that. And recently when I was at the National Association for State Veterans Homes, I've asked for some of those states that I knew were doing private management to send me their business model so that that would be something that you might want to be looking at in the future. I encourage you to do everything you can to look at this. I just think that at the end of the day, you're exactly right. It is a lot with minimum resource. And I think that MDVA has and is approaching this issue in the most responsible manner that we can within the constraints that we have. So I look forward to working with you and discussing this tomorrow further. But I just wanted to at least address those two things for you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Any questions, ma'am?
No, sir. Representative.
It's not a question, just a comment that, we're talking about the VA, the federal VA, reducing funding. But remember, when somebody is called to active duty, they're on federal orders. And I think if we're constantly putting people on active duty for war, I think our federal government should do everything they can do to make sure that we're meeting the commitment to our veterans, whether it's at the federal level or the state level, because these veterans' homes are funded through federal dollars, that the federal government better start picking up the slack and instead of backing away from their responsibility. That's just my personal comment. So.
Good. Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to testify? Okay, if not, we'll come back tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and hopefully we'll wrap things up by noon. Depends on how long Commissioner Gallucci speaks.
I'm writing it all down.
And with that, we are adjourned until tomorrow.